So I got a question recently. I want to do the whole video on the question because I think it's a fascinating question, and I can really relate to it because it defines so much of my own spiritual trip. And it goes something like this. Why isn't this working? You know, I'm doing the practicing, I'm meditating, I have a good diet, exercise, I read all the right books, and I try to become the observer of the ego. And sometimes I even have these wonderful experiences where I feel at peace and I feel maybe this is what enlightenment is. And but then it gets quickly followed up with anxiety, pain, suffering, and sometimes an even more intense sense of panic than I had before I started this whole thing. So what gives? Okay. Well, to address this, we need to really get into the nature of the ego. So the ego is a thought, but it's not just a thought. It's a very unique thought because it wants to become everything that it's not. Rather than just be a thought in the skull, it wants to be taken seriously. It wants to define our human existence. So it so desperately wants to be real. It's like Pinocchio, if you've ever gotten into the psychology of that story. It so desperately wants to be real that it would rather suffer and have anxiety and pain and exist than for consciousness to discover that it's really just a thought. So, what's happening with this process? Well, when we start off and we have these moments where we experience this sense of egolessness, and we have this kind of we've disidentified and we've had meditative experiences where we become the awareness of the ego. It's an incredibly powerful experience and it feels very good. And it's like we've put all the luggage of our story, we finally put it down for a little bit. This feels so pleasant that the ego immediately wants to get on for, the trip. It's like, that looks really good to me. And I really want that experience. I want the ego to have that experience of enlightenment. But this is exactly why the ego can't be enlightened. It can't be enlightened because the whole point is that to feel that experience that people call enlightenment is to not drag the ego around. It's to put it down and feel that our true nature isn't actually that. And so the ego wants to be everything that it can't, and which is to say, it wants to get rid of itself. And so, what do we do with all this? What's the point? Well, you can notice this game of ego trying to get rid of ego. And you can, again, in the same way that you became the observer of ego, you can become the observer of of a higher level of the ego game, where now you can observe the ego trying to get rid of ego. And you can see the more it tries to get rid of it, the more the secret of all this is it's really just trying to establish itself. And it does it so by bringing its old game, its old story to the surface. And so you can become the observer and you can notice that when isn't it strange that you can have these very interesting moments of what we could call enlightenment, and then they get followed up with anxiety or stress or panic. Or is that just a coincidence? Or is it the ego trying to reestablish itself? And so if you can become the observer of that process itself, it could take you a little bit deeper into the nature of the ego and a little bit deeper into recognizing that you're actually not it.